Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Tony Stewart, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to yet one more event in our 34th Annual Popcorn Forum and Convocation Series. Tomorrow we'll finish this 34th year of our symposium, and we have many activities tomorrow, starting at 8 o'clock with a workshop, and then there is a panel program at 11 and another one in the afternoon at 1 o'clock. And so we are just delighted you're here tonight and hope you will come back tomorrow. Before our speaker is introduced, and I did do a program with him this afternoon on television, he's highly informed on numerous subjects in history, and we're pleased to have him with us. But before he's introduced by someone else, I will take the privilege as chair of the Popcorn Forum to introduce a very, very dear friend, and I want to do that personally myself, and I would like to ask Ernie Stensgaard to please stand. Ernie, if you'd stand, please. Would you give a real warm welcome to the chair of the Coeur d'Alene Tribal Council, Ernie Stensgaard. Ernie, thank you for being here this evening. And with that, I will have my friend, who is the Director of Public Relations at North Idaho College, to introduce our speaker. She is very dedicated to many things at our campus, and I'm very happy to introduce Erna at this time.
Good evening. And again, I'd like to add my welcome to all of you to the 34th Annual Popcorn Forum and Convocation Series. It's been a wonderful week, and we've been learning lots about our neighbors up to the north, Canada, and learning a lot about new things about ourselves. Our speaker this evening is Barton Barbour, and he is an assistant professor of history at Boise State University. Barbour has written numerous books and research articles regarding the North American fur trade industry. Several of his works have been nominated for awards, including one of his pieces titled Fort Union and the Upper Missouri Fur Trade. This was a finalist for the Western Writers of America Spur Award for Best Western Nonfiction. Barbour's most recent work is a new biography on fur trader and explorer Jedediah Smith. Tonight, Barbour will share with us his expertise about the history, the life, and the legacies of Indian peoples in North America in his address, which is titled First Nations and Newcomers, Legacies of the Native American Experience in Canada and the United States. Please join me and welcome Barton Barbour.
Thank you all very much. If you can see, in just an hour, I'm going to read every word on every piece of paper I have before me. You'll see just how fast that can go. Thank you for the splendid introduction, and I'm terribly pleased that folks did show up this evening. I probably would have talked anyway, but it's ever so much better to have a few folks out there in the crowd. What I really want to do tonight, I mean, heck, how could you cover this whole story in just an hour? So what I'm really about to do is to give my version of, in an outline form, a sketch of some of the realities and imaginings having to do with Native Americans and First Nations. And I want to, once I try and identify the imaginary Indian, I want to explain, at least try to explain, how that imaginary Indian does or does not square up with the realities of policy, programs, and stuff like that. And if everything goes right, towards the end of the hour, I'll try and bring the wrap up to date by referring to a few issues of current interest having to do with Native people in our region. So, if you'll bear with me, I hope this will make sense after a while. The imaginary Indian is the one that we all grow up with if we're non-natives ourselves. And by the way, I suppose I should really start by apologizing. How come they got a white guy to give this talk anyway? Surely there was a qualified Native American somewhere that could have done it, but they couldn't find him in time, and I wanted to make a trip from Boise up to here, so I took the job. Having made that apology, though, let me forge ahead anyhow. The imaginary Indian is a hugely important player in American pop culture, and it isn't something that just turned up in Tonto or Little Beaver or Ipana toothpaste and stuff like that. Instead, if we look, and indeed what I'm going to try to do is compare Canada and the United States in these contexts as well, because our neighbor to the north, share so much in common historically, and with particular reference to Native peoples, especially in the last few decades. Native people in both the United States and Canada have played an increasingly important role, and I'm confident in predicting that the 21st century may well be the century of the Native North Americans, because there are some changes afoot in terms of sovereignty, choices, and self-determination that are terribly important, have resonance for everybody. Just think, for example, about the future of water in the West as one example. As we get more and more people and less water, and Native folks have treaty rights to water sources and things like that, they cannot be ignored. Well, how did all this start? Let's go back to one could really begin this story with the 15th or the 16th century, but I won't do that. Instead, I want to start this rap with the 19th century. If we think about imaginary Indians, and we're thinking in terms of the United States, you can't do better than identify George Catlin, an artist from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, who decided around 1830, just at the time that the Indian removal program was being implemented under the aegis of Andrew Jackson, George Catlin decided it was his mission in life to preserve the visages and the artifacts, as many as he could collect anyhow, of the Indians of the far west, the Prairie and Plains Indians, who he was certain, just as most Americans were at that time, that they were destined for extinction. So he wanted to capture portraits and ways of life, information, and stuff like that before all these Indians disappeared. And indeed, that was what many people suspected. There are other artists later in the 19th century who are also important. I'm thinking here of folks like Charles Russell or Frederick Remington, Joseph Henry Sharp, for example, who was one of the founders of the famed Taos school of artists, the American artists who went out to paint the Pueblo Indians and Hispanic people in the American Southwest. All of these things are taking place between roughly 1830 and 1900. The analog for Catlin and his ilk in the United States, if we were looking at Canadian analogs, probably the best example is a young man named Paul Kane, who traveled under the aegis of the Hudson's Bay Company from Upper Canada, meaning Ontario, all the way out to the West Coast in 1846. Kane, unlike George Catlin, was he found Indians to be disgusting sometimes and wrote that into his journal. Catlin was a unapologetic admirer of Indians, and in his admiration, of course, he fabricated some things, and this only added to the mythology of the imaginary Indian. But there are other Canadians. I'm thinking of a great example here. It's not really an artist, a performing artist, one might say, a guy named Gray Owl. The most famous Indian in Canadian history in the early 20th century was actually a British guy named Archie Bellany, who assumed an identity of a Native American and then spoke out as the voice of Native America, no matter how awkward that might have been. Finally, he was exposed as a charlatan and died in 1938. There are other artists in Canadian life in the 19th century who, Emily Carr is another example, one of the first Canadians to make her job to paint and preserve culture and personnel from the Pacific Northwest coast in Canada. So we have artists creating a graphic record of Indians, but sometimes that graphic record is credible, sometimes it's not. If we looked at other imaginary elements here, we could look at, for example, missionary programs. I can only summarize these only in the briefest fashion, but I'm thinking here of the Jesuits in New France in the 17th century, or John Eliot, a Puritan missionary in New England in the 1650s. Later on in the 19th century, most famously, I suppose, Marcus and Narcissa Whitman and the Spaldings, Henry and Eliza Spalding, the folks from the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missioners, the ABCFM, as they called it. They went out to missionize the heathen in Old Oregon in the middle 1830s. But the Protestants were not alone. Of course, Pierre-Jean de Smet, the Belgian Jesuit, and his pal Nicolas Point were also out missionizing in the Old Oregon country in the 1830s and 40s, and also in the Upper Missouri area. In fact, the United States, in the era of Ulysses S. Grant, basically the government of the United States threw up its hands, realizing it was making a terrible mess of Indian affairs, and so they handed over the administration of Indian affairs to a variety of religious folks. This became known as the Quaker or peace policy in the 1860s and 70s. In Canada, similar operations, especially between 1850 and 1900, were undertaken mainly by Anglicans, Church of England folks, Methodists, and of course the Catholics were always important in Canada. Like the missionaries in the western United States, it's true of the Canadian missionaries as well that they struggled with each other almost as much as they did struggle with what they thought of as Indian superstition and devil worship. Even when did admire certain aspects of Indians, they could not help believing that they, that is the missionaries, were still culturally and intellectually and morally superior. And all of these things then form lenses through which observers engaged Indians. But it would not be correct to say that they were getting perhaps the best view or a fair view. What else is going on? Writers in the United States and in Canada in the late 19th and 20th century began to deal with Indians in a new way. I'm thinking, for example, of Helen Hunt Jackson, who in 1881 published a book called A Century of Dishonor, which was simply about the shameful manner in which the United States government had treated Indians. And of course, she was dead right about that. But this was, mind you, 1881. The U.S. had been up and running for over, well, about 100 years. A few novelists, like Adolphe Bandelier in the United States and Marius Barbeau in Canada, produced sympathetic novels about Native people in the early 20th century. But even Marius Barbeau, who most folks would accord with at least a degree of empathy and sympathy, even Barbeau wrote, and this would be about 1928 or so, "At present," he writes, "the indications point convincingly to the extinction of the race." So even writers like that, who should have known better, couldn't help but fall into the vanishing Indian part of the imaginary Indian. Even an anthropologist like Diamond Jennis, who wrote one of the first comprehensive treatments of natives in Canada in the early 30s, wrote, somewhat morbidly one might say, "Their race is run. They calmly, rather mournfully, await the end." It's true that in the early 20th century, all sorts of problems had afflicted Native people: disease rates, alcoholism, increased warfare in the 19th century, a depletion of game, and of course the injection of a variety of alien religious faiths. All of these things impaired natives' freedom of activity and thought and so on. But if the Indians would not themselves vanish, according to the predictions, then the United States and Canada turned about to force a kind of vanishing on them. This forced vanishment was called assimilation. And the notion, indeed, this was in the U.S. Indian policy statements, you must kill the Indian to save the man. This simply meant that being a Native American was totally unacceptable in a non-Native society. Kill the Indian to save the man. This could have meant anything and did mean a lot of things. What happens in the United States around this time, that is to say in the third quarter of the 19th century, is there's a couple of important events such as the fight at the Little Bighorn, the so-called Custer Massacre in 1876, and about 10 years later when the U.S. Army ran to ground, one might say, Chief Joseph and the Nez Perces. All these sorts of things were bloody-handed enough that it began to make Americans rethink what in some respects had amounted to a kind of, it's going a bit too far to call it this, but one might call it a form of genocide. My position on genocide is quite simple. If the United States Army had attempted to execute such a policy, they probably had the power to see it to its conclusion. So I don't really buy the rap that an actual policy of genocide was ever conducted. On the other hand, killing people is one thing, killing their culture is another thing, and in that sense, I'd say that it's only fair to argue that the United States and Canada did execute such policies. One of the things that spun out of all this was what could be described as a sort of infantilization or an infantile image of the imagined Indian. And all you have to do, well, if you're as old as I am, you'd remember some of this stuff, but just let's remind ourselves a bit. In the 1950s, on the famous kiddie show called Howdy Doody, the token Indian was a fellow named Chief Thunder Thud, who was the originator of the phrase cowabunga. If you ever wondered where that came from, now you know. Then there was the Red Rider, who had his pal, Lil Beaver, a cute Indian lad who always helped Red Rider do the right thing. Boys especially, but all children in the 1950s played Indian. And this, to them, we're told, and I think this is probably fair, playing Indian represented, in a sense, if you think about it, who wanted to be the Indians? The kids who wanted to be Indians were those who were willful, high-spirited, and in a sense who rejected the normal patterns of life. So they took that as the identity for an Indian, but of course it was only play. One might ask, for example, in fact it would probably be more historically appropriate to do this, but I've never heard of it being done, why didn't American kids play masters and slaves? It seems to me that would have been far more appropriate historically than cowboys and Indians, but I guess it just didn't have quite the fun involved in it, nevertheless terribly important. You might also throw in the Lone Ranger and his pal Tonto. Of course, there's a famous joke when Tonto and the Lone Ranger get surrounded by hostiles. The Lone Ranger turns to Tonto and says, "Well, pard, looks like the jig's up, huh? Looks like we're done for." And Tonto says, "What do you mean, we, white man?" That joke should have been in, but never was in the Lone Ranger. But if you throw in all the rest of the B-Westerns the kids, when I was a lad, just wallowed in, and then there were the more sophisticated kids who might read Leatherstocking Tales, the James Fenimore Cooper books. All of these things promoted sort of phony, false images of the noble, and then the counterpart of this, the ignoble savage. Best represented today, most of us have seen probably that the remake of Last of the Mohicans, where Magua is the West Studi character, is the ignoble savage. Well, what does this mean? What it really means is it's no wonder that probably most Americans and Canadians don't think too much about real Indians who, in fact, throughout the 20th century have lived not in the center but at the margin of the national cultures in which they are part. Even the Boy Scouts, a much celebrated group, do-gooders and all that sort of thing, Boy Scouts also propagate a pop culture sterility in the image of Indians. One of the originating sort of founding spirits of Boy Scouting was Ernest Thompson Seton, who lived down in New Mexico for a few years towards the end of his life. But Seton started a woodcraft club, and he was a competitor with Arthur Baden-Powell, in a sense, to originate the Boy Scouts. But Baden-Powell's version caught on. Ernest Thompson Seton's did not, mainly because during the Great Depression, when lots of Americans were asking lots of penetrating questions about the nature of American culture, business and social culture, Seton wrote something like this: "The civilization," he puts it quite bluntly, "the civilization of the white man is a failure. It is visibly crumbling around us." And to Seton, then, Indians were, and I quote, "the most heroic race the world has ever seen, and the most spiritual civilization the world has ever seen." This sort of thing got Seton into trouble, and those who didn't like him damned him as a socialist and a communist, and this was very bad. So his version of the imaginary Indian lost out. But if you think then about the camping craze that hit the United States in the 1920s when the Good Roads movement came on and all car culture started, everybody wanted to go camping, and it seems to me, I remember this at least myself, I suspect it's still true, lots of kids when they go camping would adopt temporary Indian names, right? Because it seemed to enhance the camping experience. So everybody in North America could relate, they thought, to Indians. Then, of course, there's those ghastly school mascots and logos: Braves, Warriors, Indians, Thunderbirds, Redskins. And then we've all heard about the Atlanta Braves tomahawk chop, but even weirder than that, in my opinion, is the now no longer in evidence mascot Chief Nakahoma. Nakahoma. Well, with this kind of callous disregard and misrepresentation of Indians, it's no wonder that policy gets in trouble. In fact, let me preface my next comment with this very brief introduction to the mound builders. Most of us have heard about the mound builders, the Mississippian culture, identified by archaeologists at least. This is the most sophisticated native culture, pre-conquest native culture in the present-day United States. Mound builders, temple builders, the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio, Chillicothe, the Temple Mound in East St. Louis. These are pretty fabulous sites. And it was this stuff came to the attention of archaeologists in the 1930s and thereafter. And the assessment was, well, this was high culture stuff. This therefore could not possibly have been built by the people that we call Indians, because they're savage and not that smart. And so for generations, really, this perpetuated a myth about the mysterious disappearance of the mound builders. What happened to them? And so you get everything from space aliens to, well, all kinds of ridiculous explanations, instead of the simple one that's really staring us right in the face, and that is the mound builders are still there. That is, they're native nations. They transformed over time, but they never really disappeared. Well, given that, as one writer, a Canadian writer, wrote, he puts it this way, I think it's a quite good way to put it: if the Indian is imaginary, and could government policy, he asked, could government policy be any more realistic than the wild theories about the mound builders? And this is a pretty good question to ask, and the answer is probably not. The reason why I would argue that this is so is because if you looked at the history of policy, Indian policy as mounted by both the United States and Canada from roughly 1880 until about 1970, in both instances you would see a sustained and terribly expensive campaign to civilize and assimilate the savages. Why was this? I guess part of the reason is by the 1880s, Native Americans and First Nations no longer posed a significant military threat. But they did stand, it was thought, stand in the path of national progress, and therefore that couldn't be tolerated and something had to be done. What makes Canada somewhat different in this respect than the United States is a quite simple fact. Few facts are truly simple, but we'll try with this one, and that is that in Canada you will not find evidence of any serious, genuine warfare conducted against Native people, with only a few exceptions, like the Riel Rebellion in the middle 1880s. It was a mixed group rebellion. You're not going to find much in the way of what would qualify as slaughters, holocausts, or even warfare in Canada. The United States, by contrast, had several big-time, expensive, bloody wars. At a time when extirpation or extermination was at least potentially, if not actually, a possibility. Again, it wasn't, in my view, a genuine policy of genocide, but one could quibble about that, I suppose. Things changed, though, after repeated efforts by the United States military created bloodbaths and public outcries against it. There are a few critical turning points, like the chasing of Chief Joseph, who made quite a good stirring speech when he surrendered, or a few years earlier when the Navajos were put on the Bosque Redondo down in New Mexico as a sort of reservation experiment, and it turned more into like a concentration camp. It created an outcry, and people called for change. So by the 1880s, things started to change. Reformers took the lead here. This means, by reformers, I mean about 99.9% of these folks are non-native people who took pity on poor Lo the Indian. And they determined to save the Indian both from himself and from what looked like otherwise inevitable disappearance. And so these friends of the Indians engaged in all sorts of formal and informal policy pressure and adjustment. But the fact is that, and here's the irony, and the bitter irony indeed, that the friends of the Indians, the self-appointed friends of the Indians in the early 20th century and end of the 19th, wrought at least as much destruction on the tribes as had those soldiers and citizens earlier who sought in some cases even to deny life itself to Indians. How so? Well, I'll mention a few laws and programs in a few minutes. The result, generally speaking, is that whether you're looking at court cases, policy, military campaigns, social programs, or religious proselytizing, they all point in the same direction and they have the same end results. And this applies basically both to Canada and the United States. These results included a gravely reduced land base. In the United States, this was a function of the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887. In Canada, it was a result of a number of treaty processes carried out between roughly 1870 and 1920 or 25. Reduced land and resource base, that meant no more hunting and fishing, or at least severely limited access. And if those sources of sustenance, and they're not just food sources, they're elements of cultural identity, very important, far beyond merely their value as food. If these things were in decline or impaired, then what was going to replace them? And in both nations, the replacement was going to be agricultural education, turning native people into yeoman farmers. This idea goes way back to the era of Thomas Jefferson around 1800 and had been tried over and over again. And in some cases, it actually does have what looks like positive outcomes, but in many, many cases, it simply didn't, if for no other reason than in the United States, most of the reservations were on wretched land with inadequate water. Another result then was to educate natives away from tribal culture. You had to put them in schools. Most, or at least some of the most important earlier versions of these were off-reservation schools, places such as Carlisle, Pennsylvania, formerly used as a military barracks and transformed into an Indian school. And there were things like this going on in Canada about the same time, the mid to late 19th century and early 20th century. Sometimes these schools coerced, even kidnapped youngsters, and even in the last year or two, there have been many cases surfacing in Canada, I'm sorry to say, about physical and psychological abuse that took place in these institutions of education. Apart from those problems, the idea included in school organization was, young fellows couldn't have long hair. They weren't supposed to, nobody was supposed to speak their native tongue. They were supposed to dress and act like white kids. And the idea, allegedly, was to make them fit, really, to be included in the dominant civilization. But even when somebody did their best, they were rarely or almost never actually accepted. They might be tolerated, but not really accepted. So it really didn't work out that well. Another result of all these programs was the refusal to extend civil rights to Native people. No voting, no office holding. And the only way they could do to get the vote or run for office, take political action, would be if Native individuals renounced their tribal affiliation. And this led ultimately to what in the middle 20th century became known as, funny word, the termination program. Termination of tribal status. The purpose of this was to do away with the ancient tradition of not just tribal membership, but all the elements and prerogatives and requirements of the many, many treaties that the United States had entered into with many, many native nations. This is happening not only in the United States, but in Canada as well. The mechanisms by which these operations were put in place differed slightly, but the outcomes, the putative outcomes, that is the anticipated outcomes, were essentially identical. And so what that boiled down to as a further result is whatever degree of sovereignty was guaranteed in numerous treaties was more often than not ignored and in many, many cases callously manipulated, not only by the government agents whose job it was to oversee the treaty rights of the people under their charge, but by men of the cloth, that is, proselytizers and business interests as well, who were basically beyond the government's control or interest to control. And finally then, as if all these weren't bad enough, both in the United States, bans were put against all kinds of native ceremonial and cultural practices, such as the sun dance, the Native American church it is called today, but it was in the 19th and early 20th century simply called peyoteism. Traditional clothes, long hair, all these kinds of things were banned by governments. Now, it's important to remember in all this discussion, I think, one, just to remind us, a treaty, and this is according to the language of the United States Constitution, which definitely indicates native nations are sovereign entities. Treaties are made from nation to nation. Nothing in civil life, in legal life, is more sacred, more compelling, more important than a treaty. And if a treaty is abrogated, ignored, shredded, or torn up, it says an awful lot about the integrity or lack thereof of the nation which entered into that treaty, because they're not meant to last only a lifetime or 10 years or whatever. There is no sunset clause that I know of to speak of in any substantial treaty. Well, what then happens? Changes finally came after assimilation wasn't working very well. Military activities hadn't worked. Religious proselytizers had not transformed Native America. And so finally, in the midst of the Great Depression, which did upset many people and cause, as I said, many people to rethink some of the attitudes and behaviors of government, you wind up in the middle 1930s with a landmark piece of legislation for Native Americans in the United States, the Wheeler-Howard Act, also known as the Indian Reorganization Act. What it did was begin the process of self-determination for Native people. And it began by renewing tribal governments, which sounds like a good thing, and some Native nations did quite well under these procedures, but built into the Wheeler-Howard Act still was the idea that these tribal governments must be built upon democratic principles like those of the United States. In other words, the Bureau of Indian Affairs continued to some degree to dictate to Native nations even when they were trying to extend self-determination. Well, World War II has a big effect on this as well, mainly because Native veterans, and there are many, many of them, they served in the First and in even greater percentages in the Second World War, they therefore became beneficiaries of the GI Bill of Rights, which provided funds for education and various things. And this meant, well, learning is dangerous in a sense. Natives started to go to college in greater numbers, and this is going to change things. Mind you, at this time, many, many Native people, both in the United States and Canada, still could not vote. In 1924, citizenship was granted to all Indians in the United States, but voting rights were withheld for another generation, at least in some states, and ironically, some of those states with heavy, well, maybe it's not so ironic, or maybe it's ironic but not surprising, states like Arizona and New Mexico refused to let Indians vote until almost 1950. The last of the U.S. states to allow Indians to vote was Utah in about 1957. And they were afraid that Indians would vote in blocks in Utah, so they didn't want them to vote down there until they couldn't resist any longer. As a result of the GI rights, education starts happening. One of the dangerous things here, of course, dangerous from the establishment's point of view, is what are you going to do if Indians become lawyers? And sure enough, once they do that, they play the game of the white man by the same rules, and then they compete effectively. So that's a very good thing. All of this was aided and abetted by the civil rights movement, which most of us think about the achievement of black civil rights 1 century after slavery ended. Now that's a story in itself I don't have time to go into, but you know what I'm talking about. The fact is, if black Americans led the civil rights movement, it had all kinds of spin-offs. Other groups that felt they were repressed in the United States and elsewhere began to take up the same sort of practical causes as the civil rights movement, the marchers and boycotts and all the rest of it. And sure enough, it's going to spin out into Indian country as well. This led to things like the early fish-ins, for example, on the Pacific coast in the early 1960s, that were intended to resist state governments' interference into treaty rights. Treaty rights, again, guaranteed by the federal government that allowed unimpaired access to fishing. And states, according to the Constitution, cannot impair the sovereignty that's between the federal government and Indian nations. Well, there's other bits of legislation. By the late 1960s, things are moving pretty quickly. The Alaska Federation of Natives is put together in 1966. This ultimately, in 25 or 30 years, is going to create all kinds of better position to bargain from for the native people of Alaska. And then in 1975, you finally get an Indian Self-Determination Act. Now, if it sounds like some of this stuff is repetitious, it is. And the reason it is because it was never delivered when it was supposed to be. But the Self-Determination Act of 1975 was meant to shift the management of social welfare and other federally run programs to native tribes themselves. This was a very important step in the recent trends we see in Indian country in the United States today. Well, all of this works. The point is, self-determination is a kind of opposite to assimilation. Native people never really did want to or never did make all that much effort to assimilate. Why should they, one might ask? And so finally, after decades and decades of effort to force that program on Native people, once they get the legal authority of self-determination, which most of us already enjoy just because we're citizens of the United States, Indians could finally do things their way. So the self-determination era really runs from the 60s down to our own time, and this led to all sorts of new legislation, including Indian claims, to try and figure out what to do about lands that were unscrupulously or illegally expropriated from tribal holdings after treaties were made. The federal government was wrapped up with some 400 cases of this nature, and they thought the program would run 15 or 20 years, and it looks like it may not have an end now because they were so backed up in the early or middle to late 80s they didn't even know what to do. All of this then, if you think of this raft of legislation that can fall under the umbrella of self-determination, it sounds like a lot of positive stuff, doesn't it? It sounds indeed as though the United States were finally embracing the cultural pluralism idea that was talked about in the 1930s by John Collier when he was head of the BIA. And it's true, there are some positive things, and yet problems persist on reservations. For example, if you looked at the basic sort of social economic indicators of life for Americans, you would find Indians have the shortest life expectancy of any identified ethnic group, the highest mortality rates for infants, highest per capita suicide rates, lowest per capita incomes, highest percentages on unemployment, highest high school dropout rate, worst overall housing. Shall I go on? You get the picture. There's also health problems of a peculiar nature among some native nations, much of which I think, and I'm probably not alone in saying this, much of this can be chalked up to the commodities, the federal commodities food stuff that they've been getting for generations, at least decades, stuff that native people had never eaten much of in the historical past, and they don't do as well with it as they might with some of their own foods of choice. Since the 1980s, however, the federal government has gradually been retreating from some of its funding missions in Indian education and social programs. And recently, federal monies allocated to the native people of the United States constitutes less than 0.5% of the total federal budget. Well, all this sounds like bad news, and in a way, if you think about it, chalking off these very creepy statistics only sounds like a new wrinkle on the vanishing American, doesn't it? The vanishing Indian that won't go away. Well, there is some good news here, and bad and good is often in the eye of the beholder, but let's consider then unpleasant conditions like those that I've just listed, or a lack of useful, good federal programs and pressure by outside economic interests, especially when it has to do with oil, water, timber, stuff like that. These things in themselves are threatening, but they have impelled, one might say, native people to take countermeasures themselves. And so, for example, one of the areas where this is going to create some activities is in water use and water allocation in the West. Well, I'll come back to that in a minute. Let me just say a few things about Canadian policy, because I think the sense that a lot of Americans have, as I said before, is that if you think about it, Canada's Indian-white relations history seems like it has fewer bloody footprints than that of the United States. And it is true, but not altogether different. Canadian Indian policy was, its principal source was way back in the Proclamation Line of 1763 and the beginning of a Northern and Southern Indian Department in what became the United States west of the Appalachian Mountains during the Revolutionary era. In the 19th century, however, Canada, England began to set aside reserves. Now, the French, in the French period of Canadian history, had done similar things, but not quite highly organized. England began to set aside reserves that were held, title, that is, for these reserves was held by the Crown, and in exchange for holding that title, the Crown offered protection and assimilation. A series of treaties began in 1850 and ran to about 1920. The total is only 16 or 18, 11 numbered treaties, by which the native people yielded most all of the real estate of Canada in exchange for governmental guarantees and reserved lands. Let's see. Just, however, as in the United States, Canadian Indians didn't really control their land, nor could they really reap the economic benefits that came from those land resources. By 1870, thanks to the handing over of the Hudson's Bay Company's ancient charter that they had held by then for 2 centuries, gave them ownership, essentially sovereignty over the entirety of the Canadian West. They handed it back to England, and the Dominion of Canada was born in around 1870. Thereafter followed gold rushes, railroad building, economic and urban developments, and they had the same fundamental outcomes as did policies in the United States. And just for a few examples here. An Indian Act in Canada in 1876 offered the franchise, that is the vote to Indians, but if they were to do so and become voting Canadian citizens, they must renounce what in Canada is called status as Indians and become non-status natives, which meant they had no rights or privileges as Indians under those treaties that Native nations had made with Canada. Later, Indian Act of 1951 offered Native people, First Nations in Canada, the right to vote in national but not in provincial elections. So this would limit to a considerable degree how much voter power they would have. And it placed Indians under the same laws as all Canadians. This was tantamount to the U.S. termination policy. It got really weird in Canada in 1969 with what was called, infamously, I might say, the White Paper. Funny name, huh? Oddly, that paper was prepared by the recent Prime Minister of Canada, Jean Chrétien, who was at that time Minister of Indian Affairs. And what Chrétien was calling for at that time was the renunciation of the Indian Act and all of its amendments, the abolition of the Canadian Indian Department, and the transfer of Indian administration to the provinces from the Confederation. This would abrogate all the Confederation treaties and the responsibilities for Indian affairs. In other words, that act equaled the termination program in the United States, Canadian style. Popular outrage, and here was a bit of a difference. Popular outrage, needless to say, most of this was coming from Native people, but not all, in Canada, relegated the White Paper to the trash heap of history where it really belonged. And so it was that 1969 marked a turning point in Canada, just as, in a sense, 68 or 72 had marked in the United States legal history with respect to Native people. And so in Canada, you had the establishment by 1974 of an Office of Native Claims. The purpose was to initiate encourage, and support measures in response to the needs and aspirations of Indian and Inuit people. Therefore, this was designed to improve their social, cultural, and economic well-being. Why? Well, basically because the same sorts of conditions prevailed in Canadian reserves as you would find on U.S. reservations, the same persistent problems, the same shortages of effective policy, the same bad results of bad planning. And this was in spite of the fact that it is fair to say of Canadian Native policy that it did have a greater degree of overall consistency or continuity than did the helter-skelter, endlessly shifting policy patterns in the United States. Also, there had never been a program of forced allotments of land to break up reserves in Canada. There had been no specific termination program, but as I've said, the net results of these previous programs were just that. And again, there had been no serious history of warfare. Moreover, Canada, and this is where we can applaud our northern neighbors, I think, in fairness, Canada did not flagrantly violate as many treaties as the United States did. And finally, Canada's Indian service was considerably less corrupted than was that of the United States. By the way, in the mid and late 19th century, there was not a single government agency in any branch of U.S. government that had a rottener reputation than the Indian service. And seems strange, doesn't it? You put the worst men in charge of a very important service, and then you wonder why the results are not so good. Well, what are the legacies of all this? That was really the subject of this talk, wasn't it? Problems from the past can mean challenges for the future. There's no question about that. Much of the past is fairly described as deplorable. It's true, desperate situations continue to exist on reserves, but this is not just another wrinkle on the old face of poor Low. How so? Because we know now, most of us anyway, that Indians persist. They refuse to vanish. Moreover, they have stoutly refused to cooperate with whites' predictions and prescriptions. Indian cultures are today alive, viable, and most importantly, in a sense, they're gaining political and economic power. And so if we were to tick off a list of things, areas about Native life and culture we might all join together to celebrate, some of these may seem silly, but they're not really. The Native arts and crafts traditions are back in a big way. There are art schools for Native craftsperson. Then there's the homemade stuff. There are Native markets in many cities, powwows and other gatherings, all of which present and preserve and celebrate Native culture. There's Native filmmakers, most famously today Sherman Alexis, but there are others, both in the United States and Canada. So we're finally, really for the first time, getting a Native view and a Native voice in film. Powwow Highway, for example, and movies like that. Native American writers have been doing their stuff through much of the 20th century with pretty substantial results. A second area of celebration I would suggest is tribal restoration, the end of termination, the restoration of tribes that were either terminated or never even recognized by the United States or Canada are being recognized slowly, and this brings a kind of cohesion and solidarity, a sense of corporate purpose to Native people here and there. And this increases their ability to execute programs for cultural preservation, economic development, Indian-based education, and stuff like that. Indeed, pan-Indian coalitions are good for politics, culture, and identity because in unity there is strength. Whether it's the CERT, the Council of Energy Resource Tribes, active in the American Southwest, or what you may see in terms of native gaming consortiums, or for that matter, whaling consortiums on the Pacific Northwest. Any and all of these things might happen because these are folks who have the same interests. And finally, I think finally, a raft of federal legislation in the last 10 or 15 years, I'm thinking here of what's called NAGPRA, the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, which when that was passed, I used to work in a museum, in fact, a few of them, and museum people were totally freaked out because they thought, now the Indians are going to come and take every darn thing we have. Well, professional grave robbers had filled the museums with skeletons and all kinds of nifty material for a very long time. But not too many Americans would say, well, why don't we put George Washington's skeleton up there? How about Abraham Lincoln? But it's okay to do that to an Indian. Well, natives didn't agree. The museum people were a little nervous about this, and they feared that the native materials would be emptied from all the museums. That did not happen. In fact, what did happen was that NAGPRA created a greater degree of sensitivity in exhibit and interpretation of material culture stuff, and it created some partnerships and communication between Native nations and the museum profession. So this was a win-win situation, in a sense. And again, all of these kinds of things then help bring to life, in a real sense, not just in a lip service sense, what we like to celebrate, I think, at least we say we do, as cultural pluralism. Indeed, that's one of the things that I think is most important here, because there are different groups you can identify in our U.S. or Canadian culture who test our adherence, our commitment to cultural pluralism. And an excellent group to put in this test situation would be, not for their sake, for ours, mind you, Native Americans. If we, for example, agree that treaties are sacred things, if we agree that natives have sovereign powers, if we agree, according to federal law, that native people can practice their religion as they see fit, that they can maintain their language, their culture, and all kinds of other things, that they can have a greater hand, why shouldn't they have a greater hand in the disposition of their economic and mineral, timber, water, maritime resources? If, therefore, according to the sovereign principles of treaty making, they can engage in building casinos and having native gaming parlors and so on and so forth, these are all tests, not only legally but culturally, as to the question of whether or not we can accept people among us who do not necessarily think or act as we do. All of these things are pretty important. One of the things I think I'll leave this with, and then I'll have time for a few questions. One of the things that's the most imaginary about Indians, I think, from a white person's perspective, is the spiritual element. Isn't that so? Indians are heroic, highly skilled woodsmen and woodswomen, and they're in tune with nature. They were the first, in fact, the natural ecologists, right? They're beings in harmony with nature, emphasis on balance and conservation of resources, all this kind of stuff. Even the fact, as Calvin Martin wrote years ago, that, and he's not making it up, that in time past native hunters communicated with the animals they killed in order to preserve and ensure that those animals would be around when they needed to hunt again. All of these things fall into the sort of native spiritualism cosmology. My view is probably none of us who aren't natives can really understand this stuff, but what I do see, and here's the key, I used to live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Does that, ring a bell? In Santa Fe, they have what I call shopping cart theology, where a person goes to the co-op and picks a little Zen Buddhism, a little Catholicism, a goodly dosage of shamanistic spiritualism, and some healing crystals, and a few amulets, and some beaded bags, and they concoct their own version of some kind of theology. And therefore, it's sort of like what Frank Zappa said many years ago, if I wear a headband, I'll be an Indian. Well, it's not so, but indeed, what you find here in the case, I'm thinking of the whaling operation among the Maka people out there in Washington, in the Olympic Peninsula, where when they actually went out and killed a whale for the first time in 70 years, having gone through the whole legal program of making sure it was okay and so on and so forth, then they had a divorce, a falling out with the environmentalists, who then began to damn the Indians. And this gets us to the problem with this sort of shopping cart spirituality. Let me just read you a couple of quotes from an irked Greenpeacer or whale lover who couldn't really understand why the Makah people wanted to kill a whale. And here, this really displays the sort of bifurcated weirdness of all this. She writes, I personally have great respect for Native American spirituality and cultures. But then just later in the same paragraph, she's talking about killing a whale. This wanton act of killing certainly does not seem to be motivated by survival, respect for Earth's life forms, nor spirituality. She goes on to say that, in her opinion, it could not be that, in fact, she says, somehow I do not feel that this type of stupidity should continue to be honored. And what's she irritated about here? Well, she's irritated because the darned Indians aren't the same kind of ecological thinkers as she is. Well, there you have it. Love it or lump it. This is cultural pluralism. And while I wouldn't necessarily want to go out and blow away a whale, but that's not my business. To the people who wanted to do this, it wasn't just a whale for meat, and it certainly wasn't for kicks. It was indeed, for 70 years apparently, they had lacked access to the single most important cultural element that identified and determined their life, their reality. And so to kill one whale when the gray whale had been taken off the endangered species list 10 years earlier, etc., I really just don't see the problem. If you want to know why whales almost went under, it sure as heck wasn't because of the macaw, was it? It was because of factory whaling organized by a variety of nations in the world, not by Aboriginal people, wherever they may be hunting whales. And so this is the kind of problem that brings us face to face with the conflict in ideologies. And the fact is, according to the law, Native people have the right to do these things, and we ought to adjust to it, I think, though it also does offer some good opportunities for conversation, provided that it's not simply a screaming match of people shouting past one another, which seems to be the fashion in modern American politics. I think this is a good way to get down to more important things and perhaps gain a better understanding of people without whom the shape of North America simply would not be what it is. And therefore, it doesn't matter how you look at it, historically, culturally, pop culturally, in any way, we can't do without the native nations of North America. And this is why I think it's important to consider this sort of question. Well, I'll shut up now and see if there are any questions that I can dodge. Thank you very much.
We're going to use a microphone because we're putting this on television, and so.
Would you comment on the Canadian Métis people, the policy and what you see as might be their future regarding the Canadian government's recognition of them and their status?
Well, it sounds like you might know more about that than I do. My only sense is that, well, for those of us who aren't informed about this, the Métis are a mixed blood group in Canada that whose ancestry goes way back to the French period in the 17th century, and they became key players in the Western development of Canada in the mid-19th century. But because they didn't really have a tribal affiliation, they were left out of most of the deals. And indeed, the Métis people were involved, if I'm not mistaken, in the Riel Rebellion. Isn't that right, in the 1880s? And my sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that they're on the way to getting recognition or have already received recognition from the Dominion of Canada. Is that right? Or anybody know about this? I know that there are discussions because there are a lot of them, and I frankly don't know the details, but from what I believe I read not long ago, there's certainly an effort to get them recognized. And if you're going to argue, well, they're mixed blood people, therefore they're not Indians, that won't hold water. Indian identity is up to the members of whatever band, tribe, or nation you're talking about. So if they say we are, then I'll take them at their word for it. But does anybody have more light to shed on this?
Next question, please. Other questions?
Oh, come now.
Here's your chance.
That's it.
Anyone? You have...
I have a question.
Sure. Then let me say that thank you, Dr. Barbour, so much. You had a very detailed research, and very, very informative on both Canada and the United States. You've done a remarkable amount of research, and you were very kind to come. In fact, I have to say about him that when I asked him to come, this is spring break for his university, and he took spring break to prepare his speech and to come, and that was really thoughtful of him to do so. Let's thank him again, please.
Thank you very much for your patience. I appreciate it.
Nice to meet you. Thank you.